is the start of the History Festival. Now, it's a week long, or practically a week long. Now, that's a lot of work that goes into organising something. So can you just tell me a little bit about it?
Yeah, it is a lot of work, but because I've done it so often now, I think I always get confused on when we actually started doing the Salisbury History Festivals, but at least 5 or 6 years ago now, I would say. And it does become easier because you fit into a template of events. We know for a fact we're going to do a guided walk. One of the events is going to be 4 speakers on local history. So, we have got like a template we can fit things into. The venues and the dates might prove problematic, but that's just a matter of like a jigsaw puzzle. We're trying to fit things together. And if one speaker can't do a Tuesday, you try and fit them in for a Wednesday. So, you can pull your hair out, but it seems to just fit together in the end.
Okay, so in case you don't know, we are Time Zone Tours, and we've been doing this for 10 years now, Rob.
You wouldn't guess.
You wouldn't guess. But myself, Matt Pike, Rob Moody, Ruby for this we know. We're all historians and researchers. We have areas of different speciality, but the whole relationship that we have, working as a team, started in a pub. So it's important to remember that we were born in a pub, as was the Fishermen History Society, to be brutally honest with you all. Sunday nights 8 p.m. at the Duke of York, and it happened like that for a few months before the bravery grew, didn't it? That's where it comes from.
I don't know what he's talking about.
No. Basically, even where you're stood now is a reflection of not just the ley line in Salisbury, but the little rivulets that used to run through Salisbury, providing us with water, which I really wouldn't recommend you drink, because a lot of it was dripping through the graveyards and stuff like that. But we're here to talk about lost pubs. And Salisbury was renowned. Certainly, it's a place that had more pubs than anywhere in England at one stage. It was very, very much that was the boast we had, our humble boast for the city of Salisbury. And I'm going to start you off with one just behind you over here. The Holy Lamb, which opened in 1620. Okay. Now the great thing about the Holy Lamb is there was a building there before, a house that was there before, and it's rumoured to be where Bishop Paul himself was staying when the cathedral was under construction. Some people argue it's the oldest house in Salisbury. There's a lot of arguments about how old people's houses in Salisbury and how old pubs are. But it's a really, really interesting building. It starts off as the Holy Lamb, it becomes the Lamb, it then ends up being the Son and Lamb. But it's got this bishop's mitre there because it reflects a place where the robing traditionally happens for the Bishop of Salisbury. Now, I spent a lot of time in the last year or two researching my particular favourite Bishop of Salisbury. Everyone should have one. A chap called Bishop Seth Ward. Now, Bishop Seth Ward, he was actually made Bishop of Salisbury in 1665. Okay, he's a very important chap, and he's robed at this very place. And people gathered round to watch him walk down and accept gifts from him. But he was a bit annoyed because when he turned up at Salisbury Cathedral to inspect his palace, that was part of it, the Bishop's Palace, I'm sure you may have seen it, it's a beautiful building. His palace had turned into a pub. It had been torn down. There was apparently a Dutchman who had bought part of it, turned it into warehouses, and it was literally a pub.
So I'm going to start off talking about all the lost inns in the High Street in the 13th century, and special reference to the George behind us. So in the 13th century, if you remember that Salisbury was started 1220, so we've got the cathedral being built. According to historic monuments, if you look at the High Street, you can see the vestiges of all these inns which they have identified. So the George here behind us was an inn that was started sometime in the 13th century. We don't know entirely when. The first wall, some of the vestiges that stay from that time, is a wall which went back to New Canal. So this was a huge inn. This is a tiny part of it that's left that we see. Because there was a big quadrangle behind. The inn went back each side of the quadrangle. It went back to New Canal. So englobed in these buildings, there is one of the very old walls. Used to have a gallery around one side, around the north side. Was destroyed in 1858. They demolished most of the rest of it. But although this was a huge inn, it wasn't the biggest at all. Can you imagine there was behind us Pinnock's Inn, which was just as old, that went from the corner of New Canal, so from where you see the end of New Look, and that ended somewhere about here, probably where that is. So that is a huge frontage. It went back to the river. On one side of it was Countwell's, which had a narrow frontage, so that probably went up to Barclays Bank, but it went back to the river, Countwell's Inn. On the other side of Pinnock's, on this side, between here and the Rose, was the Angel Inn. So you can imagine that the high street was all inns.
And the Plume of Feathers, again, is a vast pub. Lots of stabling for horses. We're all going to need our horses to get here. We wouldn't have driven here on our motors. It was a very, very different time. And there's arguments about whether this is one of the original parts of the Plume of Feathers. And it depends which books you read. The Historic Monuments Register, they recognised certain timbers as being part of it. What we're talking about is a huge entertainment place. A bit like the theatre we were talking about, the Vine, but this is often used for markets. It stretches all the way across to the other side of the road there. So just knock TK Maxx out the way and it goes all the way through there. Okay, it's a big place. And I found certain stories that I've talked about over the years quite affecting. And sometimes history isn't a very nice thing. And one of the stories that's most affected me, and I hope I'm not going to bring you down, but you need to know this story, is about a lady who was performing here at the Plume of Feathers. Now, I've worked in museums for quite a long time now. The displaying of human remains is quite a controversial subject. Okay, not everybody wants to have their bones on display. In fact, when we opened the visitor centre at Stonehenge, there was big protests all about that. Now, let me tell you about a lady called Sanjay. Now, Sanjay Batman, she grew up on the Eastern Cape. Now, Sanjay Batman, she was a lovely lady. She lost her husband very young. She was only about 14 years old when she lost her husband, and she was forced into slavery. And she was brought over by the Dutch, and she was kind of favoured a little bit. She was allowed to work in a house looking after the children, but she was a dancer, a singer, and she was very popular. But the one thing about Sanjay, and I'm not being flippant here, but this is absolutely true. The thing about Sanjay is she had rather a large bottom, and it's in a way that it's kind of freaked out people from these parts of the country, because she had come from, as far as everyone's concerned, deepest, darkest Africa, and she had certain physical attributes that were completely strange to us. And I am going to find a picture of her in a minute. But basically, Sanjay had a rather large bum, and she would dance. And the whole idea then was to put on a show for people. Slavery had just been abolished, I should say. We're talking 1817, we're talking about. So slavery has been abolished, but she is a performing artiste. And she turns up at Salisbury, she's absolute sensation in London, sells out here, there and everywhere. And the show went something like this, that she would be brought out in a cage with a tamer who would sort of like pretend to whip her and bring her out. And then she was, because she's so savage, ladies and gentlemen, step back, ladies and gentlemen, you must fear her. And she would perform a dance, and then eventually, as the show went on, the crowd would tame her and be allowed to touch her bottom. I'm not making this up. I'm not making any of this up, okay?
Does sophisticate their ale. Ale for an Englishman is a natural drink. Ale must have these properties. It must be fresh and clear. It must not be ropey. That means it's been affected. Nor smoky, nor must it have no weft nor tail. Ale should not be drunk under, whatever that is, days old. Yes, 5 days old. Barley malt maketh better ale than oat malt or any other come doth. Beer is made of malt of hops and water. It is a natural drink for a Dutchman. There you are. So that's the point. We don't want those hops over here. There's a famous thing about Henry VIII calling them the something weed, didn't he? This pestilent weed. So Middle Ages. So moving in now into the Europe. The monasteries had the largest breweries in terms of commercial operations, but most beer, apart from monasteries, is brewed at home or inns. And when they made a weak beer, which was about maybe 1.5–2%, ABV, quite weak beer. It was called small beer, but it was consumed in preference to water. Because once you'd had a fermentation, it would acidify the beer, and the acidification stopped any pathogens being able to grow in it. The beer was apparently enjoyed by some Roman legionnaires. So this is a tablet in Roman Britain, 97 to 103 AD. So a cavalry officer wrote to say where and instructions to the men for the following day. This included a very polite request for beer to be sent to the garrison, which had entirely consumed its previous stock of beer. So we can know that the legionnaires fought hard, but they also drank hard by the looks of it. And I put another footnote there that sort of all these language derivations, whatever, but you'll all know, I'm sure, that the Spanish still use the word cerveza for their beer, so there's a sort of link across cerveza, cerveza. We know that the Romans brewed beer up in the north of the empire, as we said, although their beverage of choice is wine. But in London there's a tablet found, a writing tablet found in one of the building sites in London when they were doing all the archaeology. And that writing tablet mentions a maltster, which I'll come to in a minute, and a brewer, and named Tertius. So there's a written record of proof of the fact that Romans were brewing beer.
So when you're researching for something like the George Inn, now that obviously has a long history, where do you start?
Well, what is a festival without a cream tea? You've got to go there for a cream tea, haven't you? You know, it's all part of history, cream tea, especially down in Cornwall. But no, I mean, a lot of these things, how they actually work is, I knew that the Old George had a fantastic history. It's now the Boston Tea Party, so it's just a question of going into the venue and arranging a meeting with the management and saying, look, you know, we've got this idea here. What are the possibilities of putting aside some time to tell the history of the actual venue? I've been quite lucky because most of the people I approach seem to be all for it. Yeah, I don't often come against someone who says, oh no, it's not the sort of thing we want to do here. Most of the people, they want to join in. I thought I knew quite a lot about the Old George inn or hotel. It's not until you do start researching that you find out you don't know anything at all, really. You know, there's such a history to it, which is why really my wife Ruby, she talked a bit about it, and our partner Matt Pike, he talked to us. So we chose different elements of the history of George.
This is time zone, so I'm Fraud Mooney, and I've got Ruby Vittorino, fellow researcher, and Matt Pike. We're the three who are going to be telling the story and giving some information. We're all separate researchers, so apologies if some of our notes override each other.
So the George started off being 3 shops, so I think 1357, 1361. During the next 100 years, while they were actually constructing the cathedral, you can imagine when the spire was finished, I think that was 1330, that's when you start getting pilgrims coming to see the cathedral. So it's before we actually had relics in the cathedral, because obviously in the 15th century it was a popular pilgrimage Salisbury because of St Osmond, whose body was made from old Sarum, and he became a patron, he became a saint, and he was said to be able to cure lots of things. So that was a big pilgrimage. But before that, when these inns were all being remade, they were all being redone up really in the 14th century. It must have been, I'm sure, that people came to see the spire, because can you imagine what buildings looked like at the time? You know, they were 1 story, 2 story, you know, maximum 3 stories. When we arrive in Salisbury today and we see that spire from a distance, you know, it seems to really stand out of the landscape. But when we go back to medieval times and we imagine what that must have looked like to people who've never seen anything like it. I mean, it is the tallest spire in the country.
So my name's Matt, and I'm a social historian. So Time Zone, we come with sort of different strings to our bows, and if any of you have joined us on our guided walks over the years, you will find we kind of mix it up in our styles. So a social historian is someone who looks into the stories, the people factor in history. And I've worked at Stonehenge for the last 10 years, so I've met a lot of people, and I've heard a lot of stories. But I was asked to write a lecture last year about Bishop Seth Ward, which meant I spent a very long time investigating the 17th century in Salisbury, of which there's some really interesting chapters with this particular place. But I should really mention, why were people going to pubs all the time? Well, despite all the water that Salisbury has around it, this city of rivulets all around us, you really don't want to be drinking it, okay? And there's lots of references to the quality of the water in Salisbury. The wonderful historian John Aubrey refers to Salisbury as a dampish place, and he said people with gout wandering about, and he's really, really down on the place. But ultimately, you don't want to drink the water. We used to do a tour where we went through the graveyard at Halloween, and Ruby would research this story, where when they were trying to find space to put bodies in the graveyard there, they would put this thing called the searcher down, and they would push this long pole down and see what sludge would come through. And the water was coming straight the way through the graveyard, and people were drinking this sweet-tasting water. It's legendary, the sweet-tasting water of Salisbury. So you would want to come to a pub. You'd want to be drinking beer or wine. But there's a hierarchy of pubs. So we are in a inn. There are ale houses and there are taverns, and we often go past a pub and we don't really think much about that, but that really does reflect the status of the building you were going into. An ale house is the sort of place where myself and Frog would be moving about in the spit and sawdust there, drinking our beer. It was really a place for ale and no food, that sort of thing, the lowest on the ladder, if you like. And then you get inns, and there's plenty of inns about. Inns would have wine and quite possibly food, and many of them were owned by the church. And then right at the top of the end of the scale, you get taverns. Now, according to Edward VI, you're only allowed to have 2 taverns in each city. So famous visitors and that sort of thing. Well, of course, the poem alluded to it. Old Willie Shakespeare himself came to this very pub with his band of players, and we used to have a wonderful garden behind us here. And in 1608, they rehearsed for they did their final rehearsal before they performed for the first time the play As You Like It. Now, Pembroke there, Lord Pembroke over at Wilton House, was one of his biggest patrons, so they were going to show it to him for the very first time. So we know that Shakespeare himself stayed here, which is a pretty good name to have on your guest list. But then, before our next famous visitor, we have a really bad thing happen in Salisbury. So in 1627, we have a proper outbreak of plague in Salisbury, and things go rapidly downhill. We have a rather marvellous mayor at the time, Mayor Ivy. And Mayor Ivy, he makes a stand, and he's quite a religious chap, to be honest. He blames the plague on all the drunkenness and whoring that the people of Salisbury are doing. His idea to try and at least relieve the pressure was to close all the pubs in Salisbury, which is quite a controversial thing to do. Now, there's lots of myths and legends about that, and we love myths and good stories. But ultimately, one pub allegedly defied his order, and they stayed open, and people went a-drinking and carousing and all that sort of thing. And less than a week later, they were all struck down dead. My favourite person who visited is a diarist. I have 2 diarists. Okay, so now, has anybody read Samuel Pepys' diary? Has anyone actually gone that deep? I warn you, it's a bit fruity. It's a lot fruitier than you think. So it's written in a silly code, but he does write down every time he gives his wife a special cuddle, put it that way. So the motivation behind Pepys's frantic writing of his diaries between 1660 to 1669 is the fact that he's losing his eyesight, and he's desperate to do something about it. And in the end he stops, he literally just gives up writing because he can't bear it anymore, it hurts him too much. But the reason he comes to Salisbury is because of a wonderful chap called de Agni Turberville. And de Agni Turberville is a very good friend of Bishop Seth Ward, who I can talk about for hours, but he lives in the Close. And de Agni Turberville is the finest oculist in the world. He is the eye doctor of the greatest repute. We have royalty coming to see him, we have people travelling from Jamaica to come be treated by him. He is a legendary eye doctor. He is the first person to remove metal from someone's eyes using magnets. You get to splinter out someone's eyes using a magnet, and then he talks about this process and writes it down. He operates on people's eyes very, very skillfully. And when John Aubrey, in his wonderful diaries, he visits Salisbury, he talks about the number of people wandering around Salisbury hoodwinked with green velvet across their eyes because people are going to see Agni Turberville and he's trying to treat them. One of his main treating methods was to shave people's head and give them lots of tobacco. I don't know how that helped.
I have got some pictures of when they created the old George Mile, and also when they knocked out the front of the tavern, and I've got it all boarded up, but we'll hand round these pictures a bit later on. So I recently found this reference in a book by a chap called Clapperton of Salisbury, 1835. He speaks of the George as being probably the first hostelry for the reception of pilgrims visiting the cathedral, after attaining considerable celebrity as an inn, which was certainly a resort for jovial repute among the cavaliers and the gallants of fashion of that period. The ornamental woodwork at the gateway may be attributed to the 15th century, and a passage under it conducted to a court around which ran one of those covered galleries often seen in courtyards of old inns. The premises are mentioned as far back as the year 1406 in the City Register as the Old George Inn. The George contained no fewer than 13 guest chambers in addition to the tavern, a wine cellar, buttery, kitchen, chambers and parlour above the warehouse. In 1473, according to John Grimes's lease, the principal chambers in the George were the Principal Chamber, the Earl's Chamber, the Oxford Chamber, the Abington or Middle Chamber, the Squire's Chamber, the Lombard's Chamber, the Garret, the George Chamber, the Clarendon Chamber, the Undersent Chamber, the Fritz Warren Chamber, and the London Chamber. So you can see it was a huge, great place. And these rooms, these chambers were big, I have to say, really big.
So here on the top we've actually got the real Peaky Blinders. They look like that's obviously been colourised, but and down below we've got Jodie's favourite, Cillian Murphy.
Those cheekbones, right?
Oh yeah, fantastic. He was in Oppenheimer as well, wasn't he?
Yes, Oscar winning.
Well, let's not go too far. Why Cillian Murphy played Tommy Shelby all the way through, I don't know, because the man he's actually playing is Billy Kimber, really. But that's down to the director. Stephen Knight, director. Unfortunately for Billy Kimber, he decided that he wanted a bit more money, so he was going to go to the South of England racetracks. More money. He wanted to have the sort of the North of England and the South of England with his gang, the Birmingham boys, or the Birmingham boys. They were going to sew the whole thing up. But what he didn't realise was this chap here, that chap there, who is in Peaky Blinders, I believe, Charles Darby Sabrini, he was known as the king of the racecourses, and he had the whole of the South of England completely sewn up. And Billy Kimber coming into his territory was not going to work. And that's why you got these two different gangs, rival gangs from the North of England and the South of England, the Birmingham boys and Sabrini gang, actually fighting on the racecourses. And there's one report of both gangs went to Bath. There was a race on, but before they went to the races, they went to the Roman baths and actually had a huge, great punch-up in the Roman baths. And in the Bath paper, it's called the Battle of Bath Rooms. Billy Kimber, he definitely wanted to get the South of England tied up as well. He realised that Sabrini was going to cause him as much trouble as he possibly could. And so he thought, well, I know a chap who's the leader of another gang in London, the Elephant and Castle gang. And that is what I love this name, Charles Wag MacDonald. He always have these sort of like really weird names, didn't they? So Kimber and Wag got together and said, right, we'll do our best to wipe out the Sabrini gang. They were in trouble, they were in real trouble because Sabrini gangs were formidable, absolutely formidable. So Billy Kimber said, what I'll do, this is getting ridiculous, we're fighting every single race meeting, there's all these fights going on. What I'll do is I'll get together and hold a meeting with the Sabrini gang and see if we can sort this thing out so we can share the spoils of all the race courses. And Sabrini agreed to this. One of the members of the gang, the Sabrini gang, shot him in the leg. And when it went to the court case, everybody because there was a lot of people there witnessed it, probably 15 people. Everybody at the same time in the court lost their memories. That's what it actually says in the newspaper.
Well, good afternoon. Fanny Nelson. In a small country church just to the north of Salisbury, there's a memorial tablet high on the wall, on the chancel wall, which reads, Josiah Nisbet, MD, of the island of Nevis, born 7th of August 1747, died the 5th of October 1781. This monument was erected to his memory by his affectionate wife, Frances Nisbet. This brief wording is a forerunner to a story of devotion and betrayal far removed from a Wiltshire village. It's also a great story of if-onlys. Francis Herbert Woolward was born in May 1761 in the West Indies. Her father, William Woolward, had married Mary Herbert, who was a distant relative of the Earls of Pembroke at Wilton, and who died when Frances was still a baby. Nothing's known of her education. She may have been at boarding school on the island, or shared a governess with her cousins, or even possibly educated partially in Bristol or Edinburgh. However she'd been taught, she was an accomplished musician, playing both harpsichord and piano, and unusually for the period, however, she also had a firm grasp of managing and understanding financial matters, which stood her in good stead later in life. Fanny was only 17 when her father died of tetanus. He was attended by Dr. Josiah Nisbet and nursed by Fanny. At her father's death, her uncle, John Herbert, president of Nevis, offered her a home, her father having left very little money, and shortly too, Dr. Nisbet proposed marriage and was accepted by Fanny. It was less than 4 months after her father's death that they were married on the 28th of June, 1779, and almost immediately Josiah was offered a medical practice, which was formerly his uncle's, in Salisbury. There were various relatives to be visited in Bristol after they sailed from Nevis, arriving in Bristol, and then they settled into a rented house in the Cathedral Close in Salisbury. Fanny gave birth to her son there, who's also called Josiah. And today's Canon Chancellor of the Cathedral kindly let me look at the rent books for that period, warning me that I won't find anything because there was so much subletting that went on. And he was quite right, I didn't find anything, but there were some very interesting other stories to follow, if one could. The Cathedral Close at that time was not the manicured space it is today, but an unwholesome, boggy, fetid graveyard. That and the proximity of the water meadows no doubt contributed to the onset of rheumatism from which Fanny suffered for the rest of her life. It's possible that Dr. Nisbet's practice was centred on Stratford Sub-Castle, then a separate village, as that's where the memorial is, but he was not to be there for long, as he died at the age of 34, possibly from a recurrence of yellow fever, which was the scourge of the West Indies, leaving Fanny at the age of 21 with a baby and no money. The only reason we know the Nisbets lived in the close is an advertisement in the Salisbury newspaper for the sale of her furniture. But she was unable to return to Nevis immediately, as for a short time until 1782, the island was occupied by the French. So there are vague hints, this is a very obscure passage in her life, but there are vague hints that she may have spent time with friends or relatives in Bristol and London. On her return to Nevis, however, she lived with and acted as hostess to her uncle, John Herbert of Montpelier, Nevis. Meanwhile, in the West Indies, a young Captain Nelson, in full possession of all his limbs at this point, was patrolling the islands to enforce the Navigation Acts aimed at prohibiting foreign ships from trading with the British colonies. Not only had he suffered from recurring malaria, which he'd first contracted as a midshipman in India, and which exacerbated the typhoid fever from which he almost died, but he was also lumbered with Prince William Henry, third son of King George III, and sent to sea by his father, and virtually uncontrollable. So, a troublesome spare prince.
And I'm going to start off first of all by introducing the Wiltshire Yeomanry. And this individual here is the Lieutenant Colonel George Brudenell Bruce, 2nd Marquis of Aylesbury. And he was Wiltshire Yeomanry's second commandant. Now, I'm starting with him principally, really, but in the autumn and the winter, it was much harder for those labourers to find work, and many of the families starved. One of the few guaranteed jobs in South Wiltshire before mechanisation was the hand threshing with flails of cereals like wheat and barley, which separated the grain from the chaff and could provide paid employment, as I said, right the way up until Christmas. But harvests in 1828, 29 and 30 were really poor. The average value of a weekly wage for a farm labourer could buy 14 loaves in 1794, but 20 years later it only bought 9 loaves. So labourers were so desperate for food that they resorted to poaching to try and feed their families. So we are talking about a group of people who were very, very vulnerable by changes in the economy and things like the Corn Laws. Sadly for that group of workers, this sort of threshing machine could do in one day what a man with a flail could do in 10. And with fewer jobs, lower wages, and absolutely no prospect of the economic situation improving, threshing machines particularly became the focus of labourers and happiness. Okay. Now there was one person who understood, and he is something of a hero of mine, and that person was William Cobbett. And he was born in 1763, and he used his writing to champion the cause of the rural poor. And he wrote a book in 1822 called Cottage Economy, and the purpose of cottage economy was to upskill labourers and ensure that peasants could become self-sufficient. And there was advice in the book about bread making, about beer brewing, about livestock husbandry. Now his most famous book, and the one perhaps that you will remember from O-levels, was called Rural Rights, and it was published in 1830. Cobbett was horrified by what he found in South Wiltshire, and he rode from Salisbury to Warminster in 1826. And he wrote that it was not very easy for the eyes of man to discover a labouring people more miserable. And he added, and he was speaking directly about Wiltshire labourers, in taking my leave of this beautiful vale, I have to express my deep shame as an Englishman at beholding the general extreme poverty of those who cause this vale to produce such quantities of food and raiment. This is, I verily believe it, the worst used labouring people upon the face of the earth. This is a hand-coloured lithograph of Captain Swing, which is in the possession of the British Museum. And for those who can't see it, at the back, I will explain that the body is made of straw, the head is a sheaf of corn in which are flaming fireballs for eyes. The right arm is a bottle of turpentine from which burning liquid pours into a pan which is hooked on the hand. There is a lighted dark lantern, and the left arm is a cylinder of portable gas emitting flame from a tap at the elbow where it joins a firebrand with lighted matches for fingers. The right leg above the knee is an open phosphorus box resting on a bundle of matches, and with a pistol for a foot, the right leg is made of 2 barrels, pitch and tar resting on a horn of gunpowder, and the flames are bursting from the joints of the figure, and the hair is made of burning ears of wheat. Now it's important to bear in mind that during the riots, a lot of incendiaries happened. There was a lot of fire around South Wiltshire, as there was elsewhere, and a reward was put up that if you turned in an arsonist, there was a reward of £500, and that compared with a reward of £50 if you turned in a machine breaker. So fire was by far regarded the most potent in the weapons which agricultural labourers have. So the first 2 arsons then in Wiltshire during the Swing riots were early on the morning of Monday the 8th of November at Maddington, just down the road near Shrewton. A wheat rick, the property of a farmer Miles, was set alight, and the same night a straw rick was set alight 25 miles away at Wanborough. And within a fortnight there were reports of machine breaking and fires in Amesbury, Buttermere, Collingbourne, Deuces, Downton, Enford, Everley, Filding, Great Bedwin, Idmiston, Netheravon, Newton Tony, Porton, Ramsbury, Westdean, White Parish and Winterslow. Later that day, a mob of 20 men attacked Mr. Reed's threshing machine by burning it, and when the farmer tried to put out the flames, he's pelted with stones. Day before the riot at Pithouse, a mob estimated to be between 200 and 300 strong was active in the Broadchalk area, and several farms were visited. The Broadchalk farmer, Jesse Rumbold, took down his thrashing machine, hearing that the mob was in the area, and afraid that the water wheel would be found and set on fire, he had it removed from under the water and broke it into pieces himself. And when the mob arrived, they went out into the field, destroyed all that remained of the machine, and then James Lush, one of them, demanded 2 sovereigns for their work.
So I'm going to be talking to you today about the archaeology and the history of Bourne Hill Gardens. When I moved to Salisbury just over 30 years ago and started living in the area of Wyndham Park, I always thought Bourne Hill Gardens were special, but I didn't really know why. I think I do now, and that's what I'm going to try and share with you this afternoon. So, some of you may already live in the area and walk your dogs perhaps through the gardens, but I realise we've got a big audience here. Some of you may be from elsewhere in Salisbury. So what I'm going to be talking about is this area here, which is the pleasure gardens and the most historic part of the gardens. And the gardens are right next to the council house at Bourne Hill and St Edmund's Church, which you can see here. And if you look at early plans of Salisbury, like this one from 1716, you can see this is a really historic part of Salisbury. We're right in the northeast corner of the city, and you can see the city rampart here, which still survived at the time, and still only survives in 2 places actually, both in the gardens. There's a fragment at the north side of the garden, and a fragment at the south, and everything else through Salisbury has been levelled. You'll only find it in place names like Rampart Road or things like Winchester Gate. So it's a very historic part of Salisbury. We have here St Edmund's Church from 1269, and it had a college of secular priests. It's sort of a quasi-monastic institution, if you like, with priests that served both Milford and St Edmund's. In the 1870s, we have a Victorian school extension. Some of you may remember that before the new council house extension was built on the same footprint. It was put in by Reverend Bourne and extends the house to the north. In 1927, the 700th anniversary of Salisbury's charter, the grounds and the house are acquired by the local council. The grounds are open to the public for the first time, and is used as the site actually of Salisbury's 700th celebration. Part of the opening up the council house, you'll see a lot of ceremonies recorded in photographs in the grounds of the council building. And then in 2006 we have the council's modern extension on the original footprint of the Victorian schoolhouse. This was a very controversial development. I'll say a little bit about this. It was originally going to be massive and extend all the way up to the road. It was eventually cut back to be just on the size of the Victorian school extension, and saving the secret garden, as it's called, to the north, which used to be the vegetable garden of the historic house. Largely what we see today. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. He also adds a 40-acre plus park, Wyndham Park, to the north of the house. So it was a major sort of almost mini estate in Salisbury at that time. And it's only in the 1870s that Wyndham Park is sold off, doesn't become a park, and is sold off to Victorian housing developers who built all the surrounding streets. In the 1870s, we have a Victorian school extension. Some of you may remember that before the new council house extension was built on the same footprint. It was put in by Reverend Bourne and extends the house to the north. In 1927, the 700th anniversary of Salisbury's charter, the grounds and the house are acquired by the local council. The grounds are open to the public for the first time, and is used as the site actually of Salisbury's 700th celebration. Part of the opening up the council house, you'll see a lot of ceremonies recorded in photographs in the grounds of the council building.
I've just asked Ruth here what she does at Chippenham in a record office, and she said, blah, blah, blah. Go on.
It is heritage education and digital engagement. Bottom line, I'm a teacher, I do community engagement with the archives at the Wiltshire and Swindon History Centre.
There's no way I can remember that lot.
I don't remember it.
I'm only human after all.
So yeah, the world turned upside down. Sometimes a bit of a cliched phrase that's used for the civil wars, but it does quite accurately describe the sort of the turmoil that engulfed this country, say in the 17th century. This is quite a sort of a personal look in terms of looking at various aspects of the civil wars in Wiltshire. It's a huge topic, just the civil wars anyway. Even the civil wars within Wiltshire. I could do a whole talk just on Salisbury, but we'll have a little go through, see how it was all affected during that 17th century. Got the clicker working, excellent. First of all, so you, like me at school, you may well have done the Civil War, and there's Charles and Parliament, Roundheads and Cavaliers. As with all things, new research, new documents, new evidence, new interpretation, new understanding of all of these things means that we also change our terminology slightly. So I will be talking about the parliamentary or the parliamentarian army. I will be talking about the royalists. I tend not to use Roundhead and Cavalier anymore, but that's not to say that they didn't have their time. They are relevant because the Roundheads were so called because of the apprentices in London who often had short cropped hair, and it was a derogatory term. And Cavaliers equally used by the Roundheads as a derogatory term. Hence this cartoon here, which is actually the Cavaliers on the left, the Roundheads on the right with their pet dogs, and it's Prince Rupert, I think, with his poodle called Boy. And so it's sort of quite a bit more involved, but it starts off with a bit of a slanging match between the two sides. as I say, but that's probably the last time I'll use the Roundheads and Cavaliers phrase. We also have that view of, so the Roundheads in their armour, their buff jackets, the lobster pot helmets, and the Cavaliers with their flowing locks and fancy hats and colourful outfits. The reality was that on the battlefield, both were dressed very similarly, quite difficult to tell each other apart. And actually the people who made up each side, the royalists and parliamentary, you couldn't just tell by whether they were gentry, middling sort, or trade, or whatever it happened to be. The other thing that it isn't just the Civil War, there are now distinct phases. We can call them the British Civil Wars, we can call them the English Civil Wars, it's probably better to call it the British Civil Wars, and certainly the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, just because we are taking in all of what was then the kingdom plus, as I say Scotland, Wales is obviously involved with England, but Ireland as well. We've also got the Bishops' Wars. So it is a huge, huge piece that really starts with the accession of Charles to the throne, and he only actually managed about 4 years of having parliaments before he went into personal rule. So Charles definitely, he believed in the divine right, he absolutely convinced of his divine right, and there are a lot of other people who also were convinced that the monarch should have the divine right to rule. But we've got a period of time where there's quite a lot of change happening in the religious front. So obviously we do have people who are Puritan, they're wanting to purify the English church, they're wanting to change it, and in some cases quite radical. And they get a little bit more upset when Charles actually marries very quickly Henrietta Maria, who is Catholic, and there are concerns, real or not, they were perceived concerns within the country that there was a potential for the Church of England to actually be creeping back towards Catholicism. I think now it would probably be agreed that it didn't make us different. Salisbury didn't experience the Marlborough, the Malmesbury and the Devizes sieges. We didn't have that defensive we weren't that type of city, and so neither force really wanted to spend time fortifying it. But we had a lot of skirmishes, we had a lot of through traffic, both royalists and parliamentarians. And we have very, very early on, after the Battle of Edgehill, one of the very early battles, Prince Maurice coming into Salisbury, going westward to join Hopton. It's suggested he actually kept the mayor prisoner for 3 weeks. But he moves on, he doesn't really leave anybody here. Hertford, he makes the city his headquarters in May 1643. In 1644, the first experience of parliamentarian troops in Salisbury. They have been defeated at a skirmish in Warminster, and they're being pursued by royalist troops. So they come into Salisbury, and this is where Edmund Ludlow, who wrote his memoirs, obviously going to be skewed from his view, but he says that divers persons disaffected to Parliament were so unwise as to display their pleasure at the parliamentarians' defeat and being on the run, to the point where Ludlow actually returned a little while later and exacted £200 from as many people he could identify in the city who had disrespected the parliamentary army. September 1644, the King arrives in Salisbury, so Charles is here, and he's heading, he's at the head of, at this point, this really victorious royalist army in the west. While he's here, he does try to establish mini sort of garrisons, so at both Wilton and Longford House, he leaves cannon, he leaves baggage, supplies, gunpowder, all of those sorts of things. But of course they need to be looked after, and they're looked after by local militia, not looked after by the main sort of royalist army. We have then probably what is described sometimes as the Battle of Salisbury. I think it's a little bit of a grand title for what was a melee between two fairly small groups of royalists and parliamentarians. And this is December 1644, January 1645, and it's involving Ludlow again, and this time some royalist cavalry who had been quartered in the city. They tried to, Ludlow's, the royalist cavalry actually attack Ludlow's troops, and they tried to barricade themselves into the cathedral close. So some of you may be familiar with the fact that they're in the clock tower, and that at the very least, the front door is singed to the clock tower. But poor old Ludlow, again, has not got particularly professional soldiers with him, and despite trying to rally his troops to make a sort of a counterattack and get out of the close and actually take on the royalists, he finds that most of his men have just disappeared. They've melted away into the night. So he's got very few cavalry. So it's sort of ongoing. There is running skirmishes in Castle Street and Endless Street, and neither side are doing particularly well. But Ludlow is just up against bigger numbers. There's also fighting in the close itself, and the royalists, as I say, do burn down the door to the bell tower, and they actually capture this small garrison. I think garrison is probably too generous a word for this sort of motley crew. Ludlow does manage to escape, and he makes his way to Southampton. So Salisbury is actually occupied for about 5 weeks by the royalists. And they're not only exacting contributions from supporters of Parliament, but they're just not treating people particularly fairly.
We always begin like this, very untheatrically. Our intention, quite deliberate, is to distance our production from theatre. Most of our company are active members of Studio, Salisbury's leading amateur stage company, and we don't want Studio accused of second-rate theatre, because we are investigating a real human tragedy which actually took place here in Salisbury.
Mr. Blake, you have told us that when you went into your daughter's room it was in darkness, yes? Yes. Emily had some light by which she could prepare for bed, hang up her clothes, wash her face, tidy her room or whatever.
Yes, a small lamp, as I remember.
So it's reasonable to assume that if she took pills before going to bed, she could see what she was doing.
I dare say it must be, yes.
Mrs. Blake, we are seeking at this stage in the trial to establish a picture of the Blake household in the period leading up to the 5th of September last. We are not for the moment dealing with the events of your daughter's death. Do you understand?
Yes, that does not seem too difficult to grasp. What is it you wish to know?
Primarily about Emily's relation with her father and yourself, her general personality, and how these may have been affected by the arrival in your lives of the accused, William Storer.
Well, as regards to Emily, I imagine you've already heard that I was her stepmother. Her natural mother died when she was a year old, and I acquired responsibility for Emily when I married Mr. Blake.
In her last agony, she clung to you, did she not?
Yes, she clung to me and kept reiterating, hold me, Mama, I'm going to die.
I am truly sorry to have made you reduce such appalling grief, Mrs. Blake, but I feel it necessary to show that when we hear you, we are listening to the person who probably knew Emily Sophia the best.
I understand. Please continue.
Mr. Blake's pharmacy business required the assistance of a second pharmacist, a junior apothecary, did it not?
It did. That is why we engaged the services of Mr. Storer.
He engaged the services of William Storer, the accused.
Yes.
Do you have any part in the engagement?
Not professionally, no. Mr. Blake did that, as a surgeon apothecary. As husband and wife, of course, that we had some discussion about it. But that was chiefly about issues of personality.
Issues of personality? May we take it that you are talking about William Storer's personality?
Yes, you may.
And what was your impression of Storer?
One's first impression, very positive. Mr. Storer had my husband's professional approval. He was a smart, well-dressed young man. He was clearly well-educated and spoke very well. All in all, a polite, gentlemanly person.
This must have been particularly reassuring for you. I understand that Storer was to lodge with you as part of his employment.
Yes, he was not a Salisbury man.
Now, Storer is a personable young man, 26 years old, is he not?
Yes.
And your daughter, Emily, aged 18, was also living in the house, was she not?
Yes.
I am Edmund Cowder and I am Superintendent of Police in the City of Salisbury.
You're in command of the city's police force?
That is correct.
Superintendent, will you please tell the court how you became engaged in this case before us today?
Yes, certainly. On the 7th of September last, I was issued with a warrant to apprehend William Storer, that is the accused, in connection with the death of Miss Emily Blake.
What was the charge alleged on the warrant?
That he was charged on suspicion of having caused the death of Emily Sophia Blake by administering certain poisonous pills to her.
The two doctors who carried out the post-mortem on the deceased?
Yes, sir.
Were you aware of what action they took?
Yes, in due course. I was instructed to take the packet of crystals to Professor Taylor of Guy's Hospital for his expert analysis. This I did. Mostly turned out to be the sort of drugs medical men carry about with them. But there was one that aroused my suspicion.
Go on, please, describe it for us.
There were white crystals, about half an ounce of them. They were in a packet. There was part of a label to it where the letters TRYC could be made out.
Possibly part of the word strychnine. What did you do with these crystals?
On my return to Salisbury, I handed them and the other drugs to Doctors Coates and Blackmore.
Professor Taylor, I would like you now to give us your account of these pills. I have here your detailed report to the Salisbury coroner's inquest, and I would like you, if possible, to simplify this for the jury.
I shall do my best. Subject, of course, to the demands of medical integrity.
This sugar cube, which I show the jury, weighs 1/7 of an ounce. So 4 grains would be about half of this cube, correct?
As a layman's rough guide, yes.
And for future reference, 1 grain would be about 1/4 of that, yes?
Yes. But again, we are talking in rather crude layman's terms.
Quite so. But in dealing with pharmaceuticals, we shall be talking about small quantities, indeed tiny measures, shall we not?
The crystals which survived the professor's test were returned to me.
And what were the professor's findings?
He found that the crystals were 12 grains in his weight. They were strychnine in the form that is used in medicine.
The poison which killed Miss Blake in her medicine?
Yes.
If it please your lordship, the superintendent's account is corroborated by Professor Taylor's own evidence, which we have heard earlier.
Mr. Coleridge, do you have any comment?
No, my lord. We accept the superintendent's testimony. You made her up some pills.
Yes. 16 in all. Sufficient to last her till the problem was solved.
Did these pills contain the poison strychnine?
Yes. But we should not label the fact. As an apothecary, I'm aware that it is size of dosage that makes a poison. Strychnine is perfectly safe in small doses.
What were the safe quantities that you used in Miss Blake's pills?
I only used 1/8 of a gram in each pill. The lethal dosage is 1/2 grain. And as Professor Taylor testified, as we heard, Professor Taylor testified, I was working comfortably below the safety limit.